Hello, I'm Tim Russell and welcome to episode 2 of I Want to Talk About You. And first of all, to start, a big thank you to everyone who listened to episode 1 with photographer Chris Stowers. It's just about to hit 200 streams, which is amazing for the first episode of a new unknown podcast. So thank you all so much. And please keep on liking, sharing and subscribing to the podcast because it really helps. I'm really excited about this episode as my guest is one of the creators behind one of my favourite albums of all time and one of the greatest albums of the 90s, and an album which was voted the greatest Irish album of all time in 2013 by Irish radio listeners. The band is Whipping Boy, the album is Heartworm, and I'm delighted to be joined today by their guitarist Paul Page. I first interviewed Paul for a music website in 2021 to coincide with the re-release of Heartworm. So this interview covers some similar ground to that in a bit more detail, but we also talk about the band's early work, their criminally ignored third album, and how Paul finally got back to making music in 2025 after over 20 years of not picking up a guitar. He also talks about hanging out with various members of the Velvet Underground, adventures in Bono's bathroom, and upsetting Irish TV legend Gay Byrne, as well as talking very movingly about the painful reality of what happens when a band breaks up. Apologies for the lack of a transcript this time, but the software struggled both with my flu-ravaged voice and also Paul's Dublin accent. Turns out that AI does have its limits after all. Anyway, make yourself a cup of tea, get yourself comfortable, and enjoy my conversation with Whipping Boy's Paul Page. Paul, thanks very much for joining me. How are you doing?
I'm good, Tim. A pleasure to be on.
Just a quick question that I always start with. Where are you at the moment? What are you up to? What are you working on? Musically or otherwise?
Musically, yeah, it's been a busy year throughout 2025. I was recording with Dave Long as the Sentimental Tourist. So we put out 3 EPs. I just threw myself into it for like the guts of 6 months, and we just wrote and recorded, and that was great. That was my first foray back into music in over 20 years. So, and in between that, I was recording this ambient drone solo thing, which just came out in the last week. So that's out there now as Polaroid Ghost. So very busy musically at the moment.
How come you had such a long break from making music? Because 20 years is a long time for someone who was in a band for so long.
I suppose when Whipping Boy split up, and I've mentioned this before, I just disassociated myself with music, with the guitar. It was such a, I suppose it was a difficult breakup, and I kind of associated Whipping Boy and how it ended with kind of failure, and that we'd essentially it hadn't worked, and all that the 13 years we put into the band seemed to be a waste. So I just wanted to get away from making music, and obviously it went on a bit longer. I thought I might go back to it at some point, but I never really felt the urge. I still listened to music and still went to gigs and listened to music every single day, but it's only in the last year I felt that urge to create something again. So yeah, I can't say why it took so long.
The rest of the band did anything themselves, or have you all just kind of completely withdrawn?
No, I think that, during that 20 years, I know Miles put an album out as a project. He had Yelling Bones. He put one album out. Fergal was doing stuff after the band split up for a while as well. And I know Colin was playing kind of drums with a number of different bands. So yeah, we just all did different things. But I suppose for me, I just stepped away from it for a long time. But I feel like I'm making up for lost time in the last year. So yeah, working with Dave, we've just went through a really productive spell, put out 3 EPs as the Sentimental Tourist, and we're hoping to put an album out this year.
Excellent. Yeah, it's good. It must be sad when you've been so passionate about something and initially so successful with it, just to completely give up for a long time.
Yeah, and for all during that time where I was away from it, people would always say it to me, are you not doing anything musically? And it's such a shame. And Dave, I've known Dave for a long time. He was in the band Into Paradise,
Yeah.
a really good band, Irish band. Would have played a lot of the same venues in the early 90s as us, and we got to know each other. And Dave has kind of been poking away over the last few years, asking me, was I playing guitar again? And I suppose he was the impetus for this new venture starting. He knew I'd reached out to Dave to look for advice when I started playing guitar again. I wanted to try and record some, just basic ideas, and I'd heard him on a podcast talking about this little 8-track recorder he had. So I reached out to him and asked him for some advice on that. So that was his door in. He saw that I was back playing, and after a few months, he contacted me and said, "I have this song. Would you try put some guitar on it for me?" And it just snowballed from there. So yeah, it's strange how things work out. Like I would have thought back then in the early 90s when our respective bands were, playing a lot of the same venues around Dublin, that one day myself and Dave would be recording together. But it's been great.
Were you a bit rusty when you started again, or was it like riding a bike? You just picked up straight away where you left off?
I've always been very rusty, Tim. I would never have been a technically proficient guitarist, and I've always said that. Like, the kind of I've self-taught, and I kind of learned to play guitar listening to bands like the G's and Mary Chain, and I wouldn't technically be very proficient. So yeah, but I was a bit rusty, obviously, after been, the guts of 20 years. But I did get back into it. I got back to the level of competence, which wasn't very high, fairly quickly. So yeah, I'm certainly better like now than I was this time last in November 2024. When I picked up the guitar first, it was a little bit like, what is this thing? So, but no, it's been good. I didn't enjoy playing guitar after Whipping Boy. Like every time I picked it up, it felt like this kind of dead piece of wood where it used to be something magical. Like I remember when I learned to play the guitar first, stringing 3 or 4 chords together. Everything you did sounded magical on the guitar. Like no matter how basic it was. And then after Whipping Boy, those same 3 or 4 chords just sounded like nothing and just sounded dead. But it's great to have that back, the feeling that you can create something with just a few chords, few basic chords, and make something of value.
That's great. That's great. It's great to hear you back into it again. Tell us a bit about the solo album you've just put out, because there's quite an interesting inspiration behind that, isn't there? Quite an interesting story behind it.
Yeah, I read this book, and I think I read it because I saw you post something about it on Facebook, and I'm kind of love books about Everest expedition, polar expeditions. This book, Madness at the End of the Earth, by Julian Sancton, and it's about a Belgian expedition to the Antarctic back around 1897. So I read this book, thought it was really just a brilliant account of something that was, I've read about Ernest Shackleton expeditions as well. It was quite similar to that, but I just read about it, and I was making music on GarageBand at the time using a couple of apps, and I don't know how I got the idea, but I just thought I'd love to soundtrack that book. I'd like to, in my head, that journey that they went on for that on that expedition to the Antarctic. I just wanted to write the soundtrack to that in my head. So once I had the theme, and it's I've never really written music like that before, where there's this constant theme, a concept across a whole album. Once I had that concept and theme, it just made it very easy. Very basic tools used to write and record it. And it's a genre of music that I kind of like. That ambient drone, bands like Stars of the Lid, Tim Hecker, Sigur Rós, some of their more ambient stuff I really love. So it was roughly in that kind of vein. And the beauty of making music nowadays is you can make it very easy and you can distribute it very easily. Like it's so easy to put music out, to move from having a song. You can write a song and have it out there on the same day if you want it. Yeah, which is really powerful. And I suppose it harks back to even the very early days of Whipping Boy, that whole do-it-yourself mentality where, we used to do everything ourselves as Whipping Boy in the early days, like, from designing the posters, putting the flyers that we'd give out, everything was done ourselves. So I love that side of music now that, that DIY ethos is there again. So yeah, it's interesting doing something on my own because I'd never done that before. I've always worked with, you know, other musicians. So it's all
No,
on your own head.
no arguments.
No arguments, complete creative control.
It's an amazing book, though. I mean, I read that most of the times I read a book and I think that's a good book, then I put it aside and forget about it. Whereas that book, it kind of obsessed me for a while, and I was Googling about it and looking at, because there's some amazing photos from that expedition as well, which I see you've used in the artwork for the album as well.
No, I thought it was excellent, and as I say, I love books like that. My bookshelves are filled full of books about expeditions to Everest, K2, all that kind of stuff. It's just something that captures the imagination.
So the album's available on Bandcamp, and I'll put the link in the podcast description so anyone who's interested can check it out.
And it just came out on Spotify today, the dreaded Spotify.
It's on the dreaded Spotify. Yes,
yeah.
This podcast is on the dreaded Spotify as well.
Yeah. I used this Lander music distribution, and they just push it out to all the streaming platforms. So it's just up there today as well.
I'll share that. I'll share that link in the description as well. Then, right. So let's go back, maybe 30 or 40 years or so, and talk about your life sort of before Whipping Boy, how you first got into music. If you had did you have a very musical childhood, or what your early influences were, and how you first picked up a guitar?
Yeah, I suppose I wouldn't say I came, my dad played accordion fairly badly. He wasn't a musician as such, just did it as a hobby. I had two uncles who were really into Irish music, and they played, like, I remember being in my granddad's house, and they would always have a guitar and a tin whistle and be playing away. So that, I suppose, that was the first musical influence. I was kind of fascinated by this, as I say, piece of wood that you could get sounds out of it that sounded like so beautiful. So without knowing it, they probably influenced me at the very, very early stages. I would have been, 10, 11 at that stage. I suppose I started really getting into music in my, mid-teens, 15, 16. There was a neighbor of mine who had this incredible sound system, and I used to drop over to him every week, and he'd feed me all these records, Joy Division, the Smiths, lots of indie stuff from that time. And that was kind of like my musical education as such. And as you did back then, you'd tape them on a cassette. So I had this pile of tapes with handmade artwork on it, like we all had back then. And that was really it. And then I started going to see bands locally. Went to see Echo and the Bunnymen when they played in Dublin around 86, I think it was, 85. And they just blew me away. Myself and Miles, who was my cousin and was in Whipping Boy as well, we went to that gig together, and we just walked away saying, that's what we want to do. One day we're going to play on that stage. And a funny thing is, about 10 years later, we supported Nick Cave on that very stage. And just before we went on, we both said, do you remember that night? Because it was a modest enough ambition. It's not the biggest venue. We were only the support band, but it still felt like we'd made that little pact and that little vow, and it had come to pass. So, yeah, so that was really it. Then after seeing the Bunnymen, start going to more and more gigs. got our first guitars. Miles got a bass guitar. I had this cheap acoustic guitar, and then I bought an electric, and we just started playing along with our favorite records in the bedroom like everyone does. That's how we all start out, I suppose. And that was the kind of the genesis of the band. We heard from a mutual friend that Fergal, he was playing with a band called That Large Pink Devil, but we heard he wanted it out of that band. He was thinking of doing his own thing. We went along to see him, and he was this incredibly flamboyant performer. Even back then, like he had this ripped short Mohican, and he had two drummers on stage. That band had two drummers, both beating on like a big barrels, just metal barrels. So it was quite the spectacle. And we spoke to him afterwards, and yeah, we booked a rehearsal room. And Colin joined us. Fergal knew Colin from where I think they knew each other from just living in the same area, and we just had first rehearsal. It just sounded right, even though we couldn't really play. There was that spark there, and that little glint in Fergal's eye. Like I think he knew this was what he wants to do. So and we played like just cover versions like Sister Ray by the Velvets, Mr. Pharmacist and Fall, Should I Stay or Should I Go? That was the kind of early set list, and we made a couple of ham-fisted attempts at our own songs, but it just grew from there.
So it's like 80s indie disco covers, basically.
Pretty much. That didn't last long. I think maybe one or two gigs for our first couple of gigs we would have done covers, but then we jettisoned the covers once we got our 5 or 6 of our own songs. So yeah, it didn't last long. We didn't stay as an indie cabaret band for long.
So how did you come to actually start making records? Because you had the first EP and then your first album. How did you get signed?
So we'd done a couple of demo tapes in Dublin, and we did one demo tape that we decided, why don't we just put this out as a cassette only release? And again, it goes back to that DIY thing. We done a cover, put it in the shops, and it actually got reviewed in Hot Press, which we thought was a bit of a coup. Got a good review. It was a 5-track EP called Sweet Mango Ting, very heavily influenced by Sonic Youth, Big Black, some of those American noise hardcore bands, Swans. We were into that, really, the early stuff of those bands, and we put that out. And Cherie Records in England, who were an up and coming indie kind of hip label, I suppose they were like a fledgling Creation Records at the time. They'd had a bit of success with a band called The Telescopes, you probably heard of.
Remember them.
It had a bit of success, and the press kind of were interested in everything that they put out. They were at that stage as a label. So they heard that demo. Nick Allport was the owner of the label, and he said he wanted to put out an EP for us. So we travelled over to London. I think that was my first time outside of Ireland, going over to London, and yeah, it was an eye-opening experience. London just felt like a very different place, even to Dublin. So put out an EP, and I think we played our first gig in the Camden Falcon, and we shared a stage with Slowdive, which was an interesting double bill. Even back then, you could see Slowdive, like they had something. That guitar sound was magnificent. Like, yeah.
I saw them in Bangkok. They played in Bangkok 2 years ago, and they're still a fantastic live band. Have you seen them lately?
Yeah, I saw them at a festival in Kilmainham I think it was Kilmainham in Dublin last year. Yeah, and they were excellent, really excellent. But yeah, it was interesting playing with them. I think we played. I don't know if you heard of a band called Bark Psychosis. They were on Cherie as well. So we went over and played some more gigs in London. Cherie put out a second EP for us, but there was never really an option of an album. They were not really doing albums at that stage. It was really just EPs. So after we put out those EPs, and they got reasonably good press and good reviews, we kind of knew it was that avenue was closed, because there was no real future with Cherie at that point. And at that stage, an Irish label, Liquid Records, expressed an interest in putting out an album with us. So that's how we went and recorded Submarine with them. So that was all done very quickly, 11 days in the studio. Very intense recording session, I remember. There was a few band arguments and fights in the 11 days.
Get the impression you were quite a volatile band.
I think we were at that point, yeah. Funny enough, when we got to recording Heartworm was it was the easiest time we ever had in a studio. But at that point, yeah, I suppose there was that bit of volatility, and we were certainly volatile on stage. There was a couple of times one or more of the members of the band would walk off stage and storm off and storm back on again. And yeah, it was could be pretty chaotic back then. But we got through that difficult period, and I think we came out stronger. Submarine, it's good. I think it's a decent album where it wears its influences on its sleeve. You can hear the bands that we
You
were
can hear
listening to.
what you've been listening to.
Yeah,
I think on that the EP, I think I miss you and Submarine. You can definitely hear what you've been listening to. I mean, there's some great songs on there, like The Highwayman on that EP. I think it's fantastic, and Valentine 69 and the title track were great songs. But even being quite charitable, I don't think you would listen to those records and think these guys are going to make an absolute classic in 3 years' time.
No, they were very generic, like very much off their time. But then again, we were a young band learning our trade, and your influences are always going to they're always going to seep through. So yeah, Submarine, it did okay. There was lots of delays around the record coming out. The label, the label Liquid Records were an offshoot of this label called Solid Records, and Solid had released records by the Saw Doctors and the Stunning, who were commercially very successful bands in Ireland, but they decided they wanted Liquid as this kind of indie alternative wing to the label, but they never really knew how to market or what to do with the bands that they signed. So they had another band, Toasted Heretic, that were signed to that label, who were a really good band from Galway. Yeah, it just didn't really work out. They put the album out, but there was very little promotion behind it, and it kind of after they put it out, it was, what do we do now? Because we knew that was it with Liquid. They didn't approach us about doing another album, and we wouldn't have done it with them anyhow, because it had been it just felt like we were on our own.
So that album came out in 92, and then there's a 3-year gap before Heartworm comes out, which is quite a long time for a young band to be silent. What was going on during those 3 years when you were between that first album and what was to be your kind of masterwork? What was going on then?
So I suppose after Submarine came out, we played some shows, but we realized we'd kind of stagnated a little bit. We were playing the same venues around Dublin. Nothing was really happening for the bands. And there was a kind of a period where I suppose we did a bit of soul searching, whether we'd go on, what was the future of the bands. A lot of the people who had been around the bands and had been there in the lead up to Submarine disappeared. So it was just back to the four of us. And we retreated to this tiny little rehearsal room in the centre of Dublin. Someone told us this room was available, this windowless room. We barely all fitted in it together, but it cost something like, I don't know, it was €15, £15 a week. And
Wow.
we could leave the equipment set up 24/7, and that made a big difference, because the whole drudgery of arriving at a rehearsal studio, dragging your gear in, setting it up, it used to eat into the time we had to rehearse. So we could just go in there when we wanted, and that's where we started writing Heartworm. So yeah, I suppose a year after Submarine came out, we'd been playing the gigs and the same circuit of gigs. But then the following year, we started writing Heartworm, and the songs, I suppose, one of the big differences with the songs on Heartworm and Submarine is a good friend of ours, Jerry McGovern, after Submarine came out, he basically said, he challenged us. He said, it's a good album. Sonically, it sounds good, but what are you actually writing about? Like, what is Safari? What are you talking about on that album? Because I'm not hearing anything in it. It's just words. And initially we pushed back on him and said, as you would, you get defensive. But when we thought about it, we realized he was right. We had nothing to say on any of the records up until that point. So I just think there was a change of emphasis. Fergal started to write lyrics that were a lot more personal, a lot more, I suppose, rooted in where we were from and observing the people and the places that we were from. So Dublin has a big influence on Heartworm. It's referenced quite a lot throughout the record, and yeah, it was just a change of focus. It wasn't that conscious thing of we want to sound completely different to what we've done before. It did feel fairly natural, the progression musically, but lyrically, definitely, I think there was a big shift from Fergal into writing about what he knew and what he observed. So we just spent a year and a half or so writing, recording demos, and that's how we came to the attention of Sony. They got to hear one of those demos. I think the engineer passed it on to them. We didn't pass it on. We weren't shopping for a major record label at all. And they heard one of those demos and they said, look, we're really interested. We like what we hear. So it kind of snowballed from there.
Do you think it was a case of because Ireland was was really big at the time? I remember the early to mid 90s. Ireland was very fashionable. You had a lot of bands like U2, Cranberries, The Cause. You mentioned the Saw Doctors, Sinead O'Connor were all massive. Do you think there was an element of the label saying, "Oh, we've got this 4-piece rock band from Dublin who are writing these sort of big emotional rock songs"? Do you think they thought they could maybe shape you into something that would be quite popular?
Yeah, possibly. Definitely in the wake of U2, there was a lot of interest in Irish bands from like A&R men from the UK. I do think with Sony and Columbia, in in fairness to them, they never tried to change what we did. They never suggested watering down the music, and we were left when we came to recording Heartworm. I couldn't believe how little interference there was. They literally let us make the record we wanted to with our producer Warren Livesey. Might have dropped into the studio a couple of times to hear what was going on, but there was never a suggestion that, you know, this needs to sound more radio friendly, or this, the guitars there, they're too noisy or too loud, or the lyrics have to change. So yeah, in answer to your question, maybe they did see, potential to market us as another rock band in the vein of U2, but there was certainly no interference from their end that would suggest that they were trying to do that. They left us to pretty much to our own devices when it comes to recording that album.
You mentioned the producer Warren Livesey, who might seem like a bit of an odd choice because he'd worked with people like Paul Young and Deacon Blue, and okay, he'd done some alternative stuff like Coil and The and Fetus, but seems possibly like an odd choice for a band like Whipping Boy. But the album, in the end, it sounds absolutely amazing. It sounds fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, there was nothing in Warren's CV that was jumping out at us. Like, I remember some of the first names we discussed. Steve Albini was mentioned when we were. Gil Norton. Gil Norton actually came over to Dublin to meet us, and he came into a rehearsal, and we got on really well with him. He actually was in the rehearsal room for an hour, and he suggested a change to the structure of one of our songs that really worked. So I think he would have been brilliant, but we couldn't make it work. His schedule, he was just booked out. We looked at other producers, Malcolm Burns, who'd worked, Canadian guy who'd worked with Brian Eno on a few records. He came over to meet us. And Warren, it was suggested by the record company to meet him, and they thought he might be a good candidate, and we met him, and we just got on well with him. He was really passionate about what he'd heard, and he thought he could, like we did say to him, we don't want a watered down guitar album. We want it to sound big. We wanted to, when the guitars kick in, we want them to really kick in. And he was on the same page with us. He said that's exactly where that the vision I'd have for it as well. So yeah, it wasn't based on anything that he'd recorded. It was more down to the feeling we got when we spoke to him about the vision for the album, and I think it worked out really well. We used to drive Warren crazy in the studio because we kept comparing what we were doing to the demo tapes, and like it's not as good as the demo. That became like the mantra. But he just asked us, he said, look, just trust me, it's going to, when we're finished, it will sound better. And it did, in fairness to him. But yeah, we got on well with Warren. He he definitely gave that album, like he gave us the album the way we wanted it, the way we pictured it in our heads. That's the way it turned out. So
And it sounds really good, and it doesn't. I think one of the reasons it's aged well is it doesn't sound of its time. You don't hear it and think, "Oh yeah, that's a '90s album or that's an '80s album."
yeah,
And maybe if you'd recorded it with Steve Albini, it probably would have sounded very different, but it would have sounded amazing thinking about it. But at the same time, you probably would have been able to date it to sort of the early mid '90s. Whereas as it sounds now, it just sounds totally timeless, like it could have been recorded yesterday or 40 years ago.
yeah, and I think that's certainly down to Warren. I think I don't think he used some of the kind of stereotypical '90s tricks, or like around drum sounds. There was a certain drum sound at the
Yeah.
time, a certain type of guitar sound, but he didn't buy into that. And I think he would have said on a couple of occasions, you know, that if we do that, it's going to sound dated. And that's the kind of contribution he had. We also got Lou Giordano in to mix the album. Lou had mixed that Sugar album, Copper Blue.
Mm.
Um, I don't think that worked out. Lou was really a nice guy, but Warren didn't really relinquish any control to him when it came to mixing the album. So it was kind of almost redundant. And I think Lou knew from a very early set. Lou didn't have a really. I didn't think he he didn't fight his corner. He kind of deferred to Warren on a lot of those decisions, where he was being brought in just to give it a different slant. See, could he, but that was Warren. It was really Warren's album from the production side.
Do you think your influences had changed from the first album? Because obviously the music's a lot more sophisticated, and obviously the vocals are a lot more sophisticated as well. I mean, there's times on it when Fergal sounds a bit more like Nick Cave or even Frank Sinatra at some points. Had your influences changed over those 3 years?
Yeah, certainly our influences had broadened. Like in those 3 years, we'd listened to Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys. You mentioned Frank Sinatra. Fergal was a big fan of Frank Sinatra. Nick Cave was an obvious reference point, but he was a reference point going back to even the birthday party when we started out as a band. I just think we were listening to a wider range of music by the time we came to Heartworm. It wasn't just Sonic Youth to all the noisy hardcore bands. So, but there was an element as well where we didn't really listen. We weren't listening to music as much, or not like referencing. Can we do this? Make this sound a little bit more like Sonic Youth, or it was. I think we just developed a kind of our own sound where we tried to keep outside influences outside the band as much as possible, if that makes sense. When we went into that little room, we just wrote. We didn't feel like there was anything or any bands that were the predominant influence on us at that stage. So I think that's why Heartworm sounds a little bit more unique than the other two records.
Yeah, and you mentioned the lyrics before, how your friend encouraged you to write more personal lyrics. I mean, the lyrics on that album are pretty amazing. I mean, there's several moments where listening to it the first few times, I would just stop and think, fuck, did they really just sing that? I mean, the lyrics are very, very frank and open and honest, and it's like there's absolutely no filter on those lyrics at all.
Yeah, and there was a couple of moments in the studio or when in the rehearsal studio when Fergal brought those lyrics in where you kind of the hairs on the back of the neck would stand up. And it's that instinctive reaction to something that's very raw and that you wouldn't normally hear in a pop song. I remember when he brought in his notebook, and we had this piece of music that we'd been playing around with, and the track "A Natural," which
Mm.
is the last track on
Yeah,
the album. It's
the one about
spoken word.
schizophrenia.
Yeah, yeah. And Fergal just stood there at the mic with the notebook reading these lyrics out, and we were like gobsmacked. It was like, Jesus, are we going to actually put that on a record? But again, as a band, I think we were really good at recognizing those moments where, yeah, it is raw, it is unfiltered, but that's what makes it work, and
Yeah,
that's
I think
what makes it
if it
great.
affects you like that, then how's it going to affect an audience?
Exactly,
So
exactly. So, and yeah, you hear that as well in songs like "We Don't Need Nobody Else." Again,
that's an interesting song, and you do that several times on the album, where you kind of take this what seems like a romantic lyric, "We don't know anybody else, and she's the only one for me," and they end up, in the context of the song, they almost end up sounding like threats rather than romantic words.
yeah, and that song, we got we got we we were asked in interviews at the time about those songs, and it's difficult as a musician sometimes to answer on behalf of someone who's written the lyrics. But I do know a lot of Fergal's lyrics were based some were based on personal experience, but some were based on observations of things that were going on around him in his life and other people and other situations. And we never questioned that as a band. We kind of, again, if it's honest and it has an impact, I think in a song like that, I think you have to let it go. Like there was no way we'd be saying to Fergal, we can't put that on that song, because I think it would lose its power if we did that.
Did you ever get any sort of what's the word, pushback to those? Was there any controversy? Because if you released a song like "We Don't Need Nobody Else Today" with lyrics about domestic violence, it would probably cause a bit more
We did get
controversy.
it was
Was
a
there any
couple of the
pushback back
Irish, yeah,
then?
a couple of the Irish tabloids put pieces in their entertainment pages where they call out the controversial lyrics there. And I remember actually a few years ago doing a daytime interview with Dave Fanning, who you probably know. And he was really going for me on those lyrics. And you know, I kind of had to say in that interview, we'd never question a filmmaker or an author who would write about controversial topics or topics like domestic violence. We'd never, assume it was about them personally. There is license as a writer or as an artist to make a piece of art or a piece of music or write something about situations that you observe or you see. And you know I think it was I think that from what I know of that song, that's what that was. Fergal saw this with a relationship to outside, not his own relationship, but as someone else that was close to him. So I think that's where that came from. But yeah, there was some controversy, and as you say, I'd say we'd be close to being cancelled if a new band came out with a lyric now with a line like that, because people they react now. Everything's so reactive on social media. Like there's there's no you know
Nuance.
yeah, there's no nuance. It's just immediately reactive. And I think if a band came out with that now, it would be, yeah, they'd have a hard time even trying to defend it.
There's an amazing, it's one of my favorite music videos on YouTube, of you guys performing that song on the Late Late Show. So for listeners who don't know the Late Late Show, it was kind of quite a cozy afternoon Irish chat show, wasn't it? It was kind of like for the Daniel O'Donnell sort of crowd. It was a OAP audience. Who thought it was a good idea to have you guys on doing that song?
So it's on Friday evenings. Believe it or not, it's still going. So it's still, yeah, it's still on. It's different presenter now, obviously, but the presenter at the time, Gay Byrne, he's kind of seen as a legend in Irish broadcasting. And I suppose, in fairness, yeah, you're right. It had that kind of much older audience, the Daniel O'Donnell set, but it was a show that definitely brought into the mainstream subjects like domestic violence, the nature of the child abuse scandal in the church. So it did tackle controversial subjects as well as the kind of light entertainment interviews with like Des O'Connor, comedians, and it did all that. But it's quite jarring. In some ways, it reminds me a bit of the music we made because it could go seamlessly from something that would be fairly, you know, as I say, just light entertainment to something really controversial and taboo in Ireland back in the 80s. So, yeah, if you look at the history of that show, it's often cited as a really important show from that perspective. But in terms of bringing us on, it would have been the producer. I think the producer at the time um, was Colin O'Callaghan. I could be wrong on that. So, and they did feature other Irish rock bands like and alternative bands. It wasn't all Daniel O'Donnell. That's again, that's it. The mix of stuff that was on that show was crazy. But I remember getting onto the Late Late Show. Your parents, that was the sign. Nothing you would do in music would impress them, but the fact that you got on the Late Late Show meant you'd made it. You know, it was a massive thing. Like people would be stopping your parents or your aunties and uncles in the street saying, "I saw them on the Late Late Show." That was like you've made it. But that night, Gay Byrne hated us. Like he actually, he despised us with a passion. He could barely control his disdain when you watch him introducing us and afterwards talking about us. And Fergal going out off the stage right up to the audience. I think that really pissed him off because that audience was they were his audience. That was Gay Byrne's audience, and nobody did that other than Gay. Gay would often go out and sit with members of the audience and talk to them. And here you had this upstart singer going out intimidating the audience, and they looked genuinely frightened because they didn't know what he.
Looks, it's a really confrontational performance, and he's singing about drugs and domestic violence to this audience of OAPs right in their faces, and it's really,
Yeah, they
it's
looked
brilliant.
terrified. um, but yeah, it was like at the time it just felt like we didn't pay any attention. But it was only afterwards when we look back and we thought, yeah, probably that's probably didn't go down well with Middle
And you were
Ireland.
never you were never invited back. I'm assuming.
Never invited back. No, no, no. We weren't a late late type band. There was other bands and other artists like David Gray's been on it loads of times. He's still invited back because David Gray, I think became. I think one of the factors in him becoming such a big. He sold like truckloads of albums in Ireland, and I think it was down to the fact he'd been on the Late Late Show. Like the Irish public fell in love with him, whereas the opposite happened with us.
I mentioned before the whole Celtic Tiger thing that was going on at the time, and you guys always seemed slightly apart from that. You didn't play on your Irishness. In fact, you take the piss out of Bono on the record as well. Did you deliberately try and sort of avoid that whole thing, or were you cynical? Were you cynical about it?
I think we were, and Fergal would have been particular. Like this playing on the whole Irish card was just something we didn't want to do. With that, you know, there was bands like the Cars. They would have, I suppose, appealed to America because of that Irishness, but we just couldn't do that. We didn't want to, even though the album Heartworm is very much rooted in a place and a sense of place. It's a, you know, I do think Dublin had a big influence, and growing up in Dublin, the people like songs like When We Were Young is about essentially about what it was like to grow up in for me in inner city Dublin. Like, but there's bits of every all of our lives in that song. But yeah, we didn't want to play the Irish card. It just wasn't us. And there was lots of bands doing that. The whole raggle taggle scene in Ireland was very much influenced by, you know, the Waterboys, a great band, but there was loads of bands who sounded like the Waterboys around that time as well, but just didn't interest us. Yeah, and I think the whole Celtic Tiger thing, you know, I think we would have been fairly cynical about that as well. So maybe that comes through on the album.
Yeah, well, there's that line about Bono's house, about Bono having portholes in his house so he can look out over the ocean.
Yeah. The story behind that line is Fergal somehow found himself in Bono's house one evening. Now Bono wasn't there. It was, I think, one of our road crew, his dad was involved with U2, and he got keys for the house. He was minding the house while they were away or looking after it. And Fergal ended up back in Bono's house. It's a really nice, well-known house in Dalkey, Killiney, in a very salubrious area of Dublin. So Fergal was in the toilets, and he just was he realized that these porthole windows were built really low, and he just thought it occurred to him was because Bono was quite small. But he was that line, they built portholes for Bono so he could gaze out across the bay and dream about mountains. Maybe it came from so yeah. And people think it was us taking a dig at we hated U2, which really wasn't the case. I mean, I've said it before. U2, myself and Miles, one of our first gigs was going to see U2 in Crow Park. I loved early U2 up till around the Unforgettable Fire. I thought they were an amazing band. Joshua Tree is a good record as well. So we didn't really have but people certainly certainly tried to stoke that up a bit, that we were having a go at U2, which wasn't really the case, and that was just an
Was that just you
observational.
being sort of young and confrontational again, maybe?
Maybe, yeah, there was a bit of that. We did like that confrontational side, like some of the bands that we loved, like the Velvet Underground. That whole confrontational thing is something that we loved in music, and even live, there was definitely an element of that when we played live. And again, it's looking at bands like, as I said, the Velvets, the Birthday Party, early Nick Cave. It was very confrontational on stage, and we didn't want to be just a band who went out, played their songs politely and left. We wanted to leave an impression, and was that intensity about us in the early days, certainly.
So when the album came out, it got really, really good reviews. I remember buying it on the strength of the review in Melody Maker, I think it was, but it
Yeah.
didn't quite click with the public, did it? I mean, you came very, very close to the top 40 in the UK, but just outside. Why do you think it didn't quite cross over? I mean, obviously Britpop was around at the time, and it didn't really quite fit in with that.
I definitely think that was an element of it. Like there was a lot of that kind of laddish bands, Oasis, the Blur thing, and it definitely didn't fit in with that. But then again, Radiohead were quite successful around that time. There were other guitar bands who were breaking through and appearing. So in one sense, it was a good time for guitar bands, but I don't know whether our music was just a little bit too dark for mainstream success. Even the singles we put out, when you think about them, Twinkle, We Don't Need Nobody Else, and When We Were Young, I suppose, is a little bit more of a pop song. But those other two singles are very dark singles, very, very dark songs to put out as singles. So I just think it was a little bit, yeah, it was guitar music, and guitar music was enjoying some mainstream success, but it was just too dark. And we didn't really, I suppose we didn't really play the whole trying to have a certain look. We didn't want to look like, I remember Sony got two stylists to meet us one day, and they brought along a load of like clothes, and the fashion in bands at the time was quite flamboyant, like to look flamboyant. And they got us to try on all these clothes, and we tried them all on politely, and then we just went back to wearing our black t-shirts and black jeans. We just couldn't do it. It wasn't us. And, in certain respects, you had to look a bit like a rock star and a pop star, and we didn't do that. We just wore t-shirts and jeans, which, it didn't help with the whole image side of things, I think. So being a successful band is about the music, but I do think even back then it was about the image and projecting a certain type of image, which we weren't very good at.
Around that time, you toured with, you mentioned the Velvet Underground. You actually got to tour with Lou Reed as well, which must have been amazing. How was that? Because he's got a reputation. You had a reputation for being a little bit difficult. What was it like touring with him?
It was amazing. And we'd heard about these stories about Lou. The very first night of the tour, when we finished our set, Lou had his whole band waiting outside our dressing room to introduce them to us. He basically said, we're going to be together for 6 weeks. Nice to get off on a good, a good footing." And he shook hands with him, and he was brilliant to us. Like, I've probably, of all the bands we supported and all the musicians we supported, he treated us the best of any. He'd always stop and have a chat with us. Played pool with us once or twice on the tour, and at that stage, he had kind of cleaned up his act. There was no drugs. I don't think there was even alcohol, and the crew weren't allowed um drink or take any kind of drugs anywhere near him even. So no, he was a gentleman to us, and we had an amazing time. Like 6 weeks, I just kind of had to pinch myself every night. At the very start of a set, I'd stand side stage and listen to the opening chords of Sweet Jane, a song that like I'd listened to growing up, and there I was, like no more than 30 feet away from him, and he's playing this song. So I made a point of every single night on that tour, because I knew there was a finite number of gigs, of going out and listening to at least the fourth song, just because I just wanted to preserve it in memory. So we had an amazing time. Yeah, it was one of the best experiences of being in Whipping Boy. Unfortunately, it did pretty much kill our chances of any kind of relationship with the American side of Sony, because they booked us on a tour. It was to be our first US tour, with a band called Stabbing Westward, 40 dates around the US. But then we got offered a Lou Reed tour at the same time in Europe, and we told them we're not doing it, and that was it. They went cold on us after that.
Was that was that the start of the end of your relationship with the label in general? Because even though the album did pretty well, I mean, it was critically it did very well, and it how did it sell? Did it sell that well?
Overall, I think it sold. Now, this wasn't in the first. It sold about 60,000 copies. I've no idea what it sold at this stage. Yeah, I think once the album didn't get a breakthrough single, the writing was on the wall. And I think one of the part of the problem was the MD of the company loved the band. He literally came over to Dublin to try and get us to sign. EMI were interested in signing us as well, and he begged us. Like, it wasn't just an A&R guy. And I think he put, like, I think he loved the band so much and put so much pressure on the team over there, who didn't have the same love of the band. They were doing their job, the radio pluggers and the press. I think he almost, I wouldn't say turned the rest of the label against us, but I'd say they were just pissed off with him going on about us at that stage. Um, and it didn't work. Like, radio was very difficult. I don't think we got much radio play. We had 3 videos and got nothing on MTV or on, very difficult to get any traction there. So I suppose when they did the maths on how much they'd spent on videos, recording, promotion, they didn't want to continue. And we did have a 2 album firm deal, which was quite unusual back then. So we could have forced the issue and stayed with them, but we knew it was over. Like, they weren't going to do anything with us. So they paid us part of what would have been due to us for the second album, not the full amount. We negotiated that with them, and that was it. It was over. So yeah, it was disappointing. It was really disappointing, and I think the end of that relationship started to fracture relationships within the band. You start losing confidence in ourselves as a band, and you could see it seeping in terms of the relationships. You know, I think some of the band felt like that's it, we're done, whereas the rest of the band thought we should keep going and try to pull it back. But yeah, it was over after that, I think.
So I saw you guys, and I mentioned this gig when I interviewed you last time. I saw you guys at the Garage in London in late 1997. I always in my head it's always just before Christmas, but I looked it up and it's actually November 1997. And I always remember Fergal coming out, and I always remember Fergal as being this sort of skinny guy with sort of long dark hair. And he came out and he put on quite a lot of weight. He was a big guy, and he was sort of half naked and like covered in like it looked like silver body paint or blue body paint or something. And, and I remember thinking, have I come to see the right band here? Because you look completely different. I remember it being a really great gig, but it was clear that things had changed a little bit. Do you
Yeah,
remember that?
I do remember, and I think there was, I don't know whether it was a kind of a desperation creeping into the band at that stage, and you know, trying to trying to grab back some of that confrontational thing that had been there before, but it just wasn't working anymore. And I think behind the scenes, we were doing those gigs, but there was so much self doubt in the band at that stage. You know, we felt like the writing was on the wall. We'd recorded some songs, demoed some songs for what should have been the third album with Sony, and they'd heard those demos. Now they were really rough demos. They weren't like the demos we had for Heartworm, where we went into a proper studio. They were on a kind of a porta studio, and they didn't like them, or they didn't, that was another reason they didn't want to do they were going to look for something that sounded like a definite hit, or there was no point in continuing. So we'd recorded some of those demos, and I think we felt that there was definitely another good album in us. um and we got to the point where we'd enough songs to do another album, but all the while the relationships that were fracturing within the bands. By the time we came to record the third album, the relationships had broken down, and we were at the silly stage where we were going into the studio at separate times to record. So I always feel I'm really proud of the third album, because to get it finished at all was almost a miracle. But it always sounds to me like in the songs you can hear there's a weariness and a tiredness about I think
Well,
so
let's
much.
talk a little bit about that third album, because obviously, when people talk to you, they always want to talk about Heartworm,
Yeah.
which is understandable because it's this classic album that everyone still loves. But that third album, listening to it again this week, is really good. I mean, it sounds controversial, but I think the songs are probably as good a collection of songs as Heartworm is. It maybe doesn't hang together as cohesively an album as Heartworm does, and it maybe doesn't have that energy and intensity, but the songs on it are great, and it still sounds really good as well.
Yeah, and lyrically I think Fergal, the lyrics on it were as good. Were probably a little less personal, but a little bit more political, or you know, kind of a social commentary thing going through the lyrics. And I agree with you. I think some of the songs on it are brilliant. If they'd have got the same treatment as the Heartworm songs, recorded in a proper studio with a really good producer, I think they would have sounded huge. But it was recorded in a small studio, a lot less time, um, and under very difficult circumstances. Like, you know, that whole revolving doors where we'd go in and record at separate times to Fergal, and it wasn't for convenience. It was because things had broken down relationship wise, which is sad to look back on. But the whole goal was to try and get the third album finished and released, and do some promotion with it. But we never played a gig. The album came out 2 years after we'd split up in 2000. Like, we finished it in 98, I think, and it came out in 2000. So it was dead on arrival. It literally
Yeah, I don't
came
even
out.
remember it coming out. I mean, I was a big fan of Heartworm, but I don't even remember that third album
Yeah, I
coming
think
out at
you
the
wouldn't
time.
be on your own there. I don't think it got a limited release. I don't know, maybe 500 CDs. That was it, and that was it.
Because what I like most about that album is that last track, "No Place to Go," where it's this huge, like, big show-stopping song, and it takes a little diversion into death metal almost towards the end. It sounds like you knew it was the last song you were going to record, and you all just thought, "Fuck it, let's just turn everything up to 11 and do this big loud." crazy song. Is that right? Or
Yeah, you're not too far wrong. Certainly when we came to sequencing the album, like it probably wasn't the last song we had written. I don't know where it came in that sequence, but when it came to actually sequencing the album, I think putting her at the end probably was a sign that this was the full stop. We'd come to the end of the line. And I think the fourth song, So Much for Love, which
which is
sounds,
a great song as well.
yeah,
It's a
and it
pop.
sounds
It's
like
almost a pop song, isn't it?
it is, yeah, and it sounds like a kind of a romantic song, but I always interpret it as, the breakup of the band and a song about a band where
Yes,
the love,
I wish we could kiss like we used to, or
yeah,
something. Which
yeah. So yeah, I think it is a lost album. I would have loved to see it come out, and there was some momentum to do that and put Submarine out, uh, uh, a reissue of Submarine to mid last year. But I just think the momentum has died. All the band are doing different things, and the motivation to do a lot of this stuff. Whereas lots of people would love to see this stuff coming out. I don't know if all the members of the band are behind it and want to do it. I think some of the band would prefer just to let things go, just to not to hark back to the old stuff again and hark
it's a
back.
shame because I think there's about 7 tracks available from that album on YouTube. The rest you can't find them anywhere. So
Yeah,
I
and
don't know
even
how good the
even
rest of the
putting it out
songs are.
digitally would be a good idea. But again, getting that together, we never did things easy as a band. I will say that, like, you know, I remember even trying to agree the artwork for Heartworm was a torturous process. It took weeks and weeks of back and forth and little change. So things like that were always a bit difficult for us as a band. The music used to come instinctively, and generally that would be the easiest part. It's the stuff outside that I think has often been the most difficult thing for us.
Is that you think because you were sort of young guys in your 20s, and young guys in their 20s aren't always the best at communicating and giving way? Do you think if you'd sat down in say 1998 and thrashed it out and communicated better, you could have carried on longer?
Maybe, yeah, maybe. But I do think there was the element that we'd come to a natural end as well. Like we had been together 13 years. It wasn't like, you know, we'd been around for 3 or 4 years. There was a lot of miles on the clock. We'd been gone through a lot of ups and downs as a band, um, and it just felt like other bands had come along as well. We weren't the new kids on the block anymore. When Heartworm came out, we were essentially like a new band to a lot of people because they wouldn't have that awareness of Submarine, even in Ireland. Like, it was we weren't that well known, but I always remember that band, The Trills. I don't know if you remember an Irish band, The Trills. They put out this brilliant Force debut album, and they were the flavour of the month in Ireland, particularly. And did really well in America with that album as well. So Much for the City, I
Mm.
think it's called. Um,
Yeah, it's a great album. I like that album.
it's a great album, and they were like everyone loved them. By the second album, they were being lampooned on radio shows for stupid things about like where they were from because they are kind of from a more middle class background, and people like their second album didn't sell at all. Like you just shows you how fickle you know music fans can be, and just the public when it comes to they'll jump on a bandwagon, and when there's a lot of people talking about they're on it, but very quickly it can turn. And it did feel like after Heartworm, it was always going to be a hard sell if things didn't happen for us. Getting people interested, we could have played the same circuit around Dublin and Ireland for a while, and yeah, but like that didn't really appeal to us at that point, 13 years on.
So it's what, 98, 99, the band's split up. Well, you said it was a pretty devastating breakup. I mean, you probably would have thought around the time of Heartworm, oh, we're on a major label, we're touring with Lou Reed. This is my life now. This is my job. And then suddenly, what, 3 or 4 years later, you're back at home and it's all over. How did that feel at the time?
Yeah, I really struggled for a few years, like really struggled, and I probably wasn't even aware of it at the time. But I went back to work. I had a wife and a family, so I had to go back to work. I had no choice. You know, as much as I'd love him to continue making music, it wasn't going to pay the bills. But I did find it really, really hard, and I'm sure the other members of the band did as well. In their own ways, like it was just very difficult to adjust to, to life without that lifestyle. And not that it was a lifestyle. We weren't a real, believe it or not, rock and roll lifestyle band at all. Like there wasn't, there was no problem with drugs or alcohol in the band. We just did it for the music. But the lifestyle would have been going to rehearse or going to write songs in the daytime rather than going to a 9 to 5 job. Adjusting to that was very difficult for me. But I had to do it, and kind of fell out of love. I think I alluded to this earlier. I just didn't want to know. The guitar was just associated with negative things in my life, and that failure that I perceived as Whipping Boy, because the album been a commercial hadn't been a commercial success at all. Like I thought, that's it. Heartworm's going to be a bargain bin album that I'll be seeing in record shops for the next 10 years. Got on sale for like €3 or something like that. But what happened was quite different. you know, um, Over the years, the album started popping up in, best Irish albums of all time polls.
It was voted the best Irish album of all time, wasn't it, in
In,
Hot Press?
in one poll, I don't know if it was Hot Press. There was other polls like Phantom Radio, which was the biggest indie kind of radio station over here. Certainly was always in the conversation in the top 5, top 8 albums and everything. And I would see on social media there seemed to be a new wave of people getting interested in the album. And then in the last 5 to 10 years, like with bands like the Fontaines, who cited us as an influence, Gorriers, another great band from Cork, the Cardinals. I went to see them play a couple of years, I think it was about 2 years ago, and they were doing a cover of I Think I Miss You, which was mind blowing because I didn't know how a young band like that would have even got to hear that EP, because they certainly wouldn't have seen us play live. So to see that the album over that period of time after we split, it just seemed to grow and grow and grow. And by the time we reissued it a couple of years ago, it got to number 4 in the Irish charts when we reissued, which was incredible. All those years later. So yeah, it's a funny thing, but yeah, I did find it very difficult for a number of years just to, I suppose, adapt to the new life, which was a life without Whipping Boy. And I never wanted to play in another band. Like I couldn't have played in another band. I always said this. I don't think I would have been able to play with another band, and just it my the way I learned to play guitar as a member of Whipping Boy, so it would have been really hard to adjust to playing with another band at that point. So I just left music aside for a long, long time.
The band did reform a couple of times, didn't you? You reformed in, was it 2006 and then 2010, 11 to do you did a few shows?
So the first time the band reformed, it wasn't the full band. I wasn't involved in that. Miles wasn't involved. It was Fergal and Colm, and they got in some other musicians, which in itself caused a bit of bad feeling at the time. But look, we got over that, and I mentioned to you earlier on, I think the band get on well now. We met earlier this year and went to see John Cale together, and I think there's a recognition within the band. We look back on all the positive things we did together as a band, and the negative stuff is in the past. We did reform and did a tour. Was it 2010? I think it's 2010. Yeah, and it was good. It was good. It didn't feel the same for me, because it wasn't the same. We weren't young guys anymore. But it was nice to do it, and nice to rekindle the relationship with the other guys at that
And there
point.
must have been great audience reactions then as well, because those audiences would have lived with the album a longer time and probably been closer to it than the audiences you toured to originally back in the 90s.
Absolutely, yeah. We had great crowds at all the gigs we did, but we just did the one tour, and we kind of said tentatively there was this talk at the time that we might do more recording together. And I think some members of the band felt, yeah, if we do more recording, there'd be a future, but we're not going to just keep going doing, the greatest hits tours. Yeah. And we just couldn't get it together where like we were all living in different parts of the country. So it was too difficult really. Um Funny enough, now it's so much easier because the stuff I'm doing now with Dave, I hadn't met Dave. We'd put out two EPs and we hadn't been in the same room as each other. He lives down in Kerry and I live in Dublin still. So we've been exchanging stuff by email all the time. That's how we recorded the records. But back then, you know, I suppose to record the technology to do that wasn't as developed. So yeah, we formed for one tour and that was it. We didn't continue to play. And there's been a clamor in recent years, and we've had really good offers to play tours, to get back together, offers of festivals, but you know, it's the will isn't there to do it, I don't think, amongst. Look, I'd never see. I said never before after we split up, but look, I think it's getting it's less likely. I just don't think there's collective will there to go out and do it. And there's lots of reasons, and it's nothing to do with the relationships in the band because, as I said, we're all on we're on speaking terms now. We don't see the lads that much because again, we're not all living in Dublin, but we did meet up, as I said, and had a great night. But yeah, I don't see it happening, to be honest, playing again.
So, last question. We've been going for what, an hour and 10 minutes. So I'll make this the last question. When you look back on your career in Whipping Boys, is it with kind of regret that you only did 3 albums, that it didn't last longer, or is it with this sort of pride that you created this album that's still over 30 years on, people are just still absolutely obsessed with, or is it a mix?
No, I think it's definitely pride. There's bands who've released 10, 15 albums and wouldn't have an album that's, I suppose, seems to be as cherished by people who love it as much as they do with Heartworm. So, like as I said to you, I saw what we did as a failure at the time, but I've kind of reevaluated what failure means now because failure isn't necessarily about, and particularly in music, isn't about shifting units and selling records. Like success can be how much you've influenced other musicians, how much a record means to people that they pass it on to family members and children, and that means that to me is as much and as successful as selling lots of records now. Maybe at the time when in the raw aftermath of Whipping Boy, it didn't feel like that. It felt like we'd put so much into this band and this kind of collective thing for 13 years and nothing came of it. But I can see now over the years how much that album means to people, how much it's influenced a new generation of Irish musicians, and that means a lot.
Well, surely that's the point of art, any kind of art, isn't it? We talked earlier about books, films, music. It's no one remembers how many people went to see a particular film or how many people bought a particular book. It's how much it touches you and how long it lives with you.
Yeah, and I suppose I can see that now, but in the after, it was so raw after the band split up, it did feel like a failure, but it's not. I mean, Heartworm has left a mark, which is something that I wouldn't have when we were in that recording studio. I couldn't have dreamed that people would still be listening to it 30 years later. Like even if it had been successful, I wouldn't have thought that. So the fact that it's still being acknowledged as something of value to me is worth so much.
Brilliant. So what's next for you? You've picked up your guitar again. You're making music again. Have you got any more plans to release more stuff? Are you back sort of addicted and fully into it now?
I think I am, yeah. um, I'm, yeah. So the big focus for me is recording as the Sentimental Tourist with Dave. We work quickly. We work with fairly lo-fi equipment, but that's all I want. We're both not going to obsess about every sound the way I might have when we were, younger. We're going to just record songs quickly, put them out there, and if people like them, great. If they don't, it doesn't really matter to us. It's more about what it means for us, and you know, um, that's the future. I hope to put out an album this year with Dave as the Sentimental Tourists. It's great. We've put out some EPs on Bandcamp, but I would like to put something out on a physical release on vinyl or on CD.
Any
And
gigs?
we're doing one gig. I don't know why I agreed to do this because I don't even know how we're going to rehearse for it, given that we're in different parts of the country. But we're playing on Cape Clear Island in July. So it's this tiny island off the southwest coast of Ireland. I think there's only 130 people live on the island, but this festival every year called Bobstock, and it's centered around the one pub. I think there's one pub on the island, and there's been some really good acts have played there, Irish acts, and they asked us to do it. I think back in August, September. I kind of agreed to do it, so yeah, we're going to do that. It might just be it might just be an acoustic show because like we don't have a full band, even though there's bass and drums on the EPs. It's just me and Dave, so it might just be an acoustic show, but it's something. I'm having stress dreams about it already because it's so long since I've played live. So we'll
Maybe you'll
see.
get back on the Late Late Show again. Second
Yeah,
second
I
appearance.
somehow doubt it. They've long memories on that show. It was
Still got a grudge against you after the first
they
time.
still bear the scars of that. Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks very much, Paul, for joining me. It's been brilliant. It's been really interesting. Thanks for giving up
Thanks for having me,
an hour and a
Tim.
half of your Saturday.
No problem at all. And yeah,
And great to talk to you, and good luck with the new album.
thanks, Tim.
Thank you. Huge thanks to Paul for taking the time to join me and to talk so openly about his life in music. That was really interesting. If you're not familiar with Whipping Boy or Paul's recent projects, check out the links in the podcast description. And of course, again, please like, share, rate, and subscribe to the podcast to help with my visibility and to stay updated on future episodes. And on that subject, episode 3 will be out on 12 February and will feature another musician, Martin Bowes of UK darkwave pioneers Attrition. Until then, thanks for listening and see you soon.